So the Supreme Court decided to do a very Supreme Court type thing. They made a horrible and insane decision on immigration that I'm going to walk you through. But keep in mind, as we're going through this, there's another giant twist coming in the story, okay? And we'll get to that too. So this is in the Associated Press from yesterday. Supreme Court lifts stay on Texas law that gives police broad powers to arrest migrants at the border. So it was divided. I believe there were 3 justices who were against this, but the others were in favor of it. And they said Texas is trying to enforce their own immigration law. And anybody who they suspect, round up, check, and then ship out if they want to ship it out. And they're being very aggressive. They put up like barbed wire buoys and shit like that. And the Supreme Court here said, yeah, you're allowed to do that. Now, why is that a problem? It's a problem because when you look at precedent and when you look at the history of case law, it's been reaffirmed over and over again that border policy is clearly in the purview of federal policy. And so, for example, and they go on to explain this in this article too, by the way, there was a Supreme Court case in 2012 where Arizona passed this law called like Show Me Your Papers law, right? Or at least that's what people called it. And they were trying also to enforce their own border policy, and they were becoming incredibly harsh, cracking down. You know, basically it was like free license to harass people who have a slightly darker skin complexion, and they tried to deport people themselves. They tried to crack down on the border. And the Supreme Court said at the time in 2012, by the way, still a conservative Supreme Court at the time, they said, look, our hands are tied here. The supremacy clause of the Constitution is clear. The border is solely in the purview of the federal government. You can't have state border policy superseding federal border policy. So in other words, this is on Border Patrol. This is on the federal government. The state cannot override the federal government. The federal government says, hey, don't do that. You're getting in our way and interfering with the way we do this. They have to stop. And one of the biggest problems is a lot of the people at the state level who try to enforce this, they don't know all of the ins and outs of border law. They don't know what is acceptable and is unacceptable. Whereas the ones that are federally trained do know more of that. So in 2012, it was upheld. Very clear-cut case, supremacy clause of the Constitution. Arizona can't override the federal government when it comes to border policy. Now, Texas is trying to do the same thing, and the Supreme Court stepped in to say, at least temporarily, yes, you can go and enforce your Texas border law. So let me read you some of this. A divided Supreme Court on Tuesday lifted a stay on a Texas law that gives police broad powers to arrest migrants suspected of crossing the border illegally, while a legal battle over immigration authority plays out. The Biden administration is suing to strike down the measure, arguing it's a clear violation of federal authority that would hurt international relations and create chaos in administering immigration law. Texas has argued it has a right to take action over what authorities have called an ongoing crisis at the southern border. Opponents say the law, known as Senate Bill 4, the most dramatic attempt by a state to police immigration since an Arizona law more than a decade ago, portions of which were struck down by the Supreme Court. Critics have also said the Texas law could lead to civil rights violations and racial profiling. A federal judge in Texas struck down the law in late February, but the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals quickly stayed the ruling, leading the federal government to appeal to the Supreme Court. So what the Supreme Court did is they said, and the 3 that dissented, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, and Sotomayor wrote a blistering dissent. But they said, look, we are going to make it so that Texas is allowed to do this, but we're also going to throw it back to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for them to make a decision. Then, massive twist in the case, boom, this morning. Texas immigration law back on hold after appeals court ruling. Texas's strict new immigration law giving state police powers to arrest people on suspicion of illegally crossing the Mexico border was back on hold late Tuesday, hours after the U.S. Supreme Court allowed it to take effect. A federal appeals court temporarily blocked the law, known as SB 4, from taking effect in a 2-1 order late Tuesday. The Supreme Court's majority ruling didn't uphold the law, but briefly cleared the way for the state to begin enforcing the measure. That was until the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals temporarily put the law back on hold ahead of hearing legal challenges against it on Wednesday. One panel member, Circuit Judge Andrew Oldham, dissented, saying, I would leave that stay in place pending tomorrow's oral arguments on the question. The law was challenged by the Department of Justice over concerns that it encroached on the federal government's authority over immigration and by immigration advocacy organizations that have said it could lead to racial profiling. The Supreme Court's decision marked a victory for Texas Governor Greg Abbott and his fellow Republicans who have made the recent increase in illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border a central issue in the 2024 elections. So that's the gist of it. The Supreme Court stepped in and said, all right, we're going to allow the law to stand at least temporarily, then threw it back to the Fifth Circuit Court. Fifth Circuit Court said, no, we're going to stay them enforcing this law, and now the case will proceed. But this has already given me massive red flag vibes here, because it's literally, I can't wrap my mind around the Supreme Court saying it's okay to enforce this law in the meantime, because we have history that we know this exact kind of fight has been had before, and the states were slapped down. So I sort of shudder at the thought of what's going to happen with this law. But remember, guys, we also had a similar case very recently where it was the same thing, and the Supreme Court ruled incorrectly. So now, final point is, if they end up at the place where they say, yes, Texas state law overrides federal law when it comes to immigration, if that's where they end up, I don't want to hear another fucking word about originalism from conservatives and Republicans ever again. Because they are not originalists. They are not, let's go by the plain-faced text of the Constitution, let's interpret it as the founders meant it. Because they would be 100% endorsing the opposite philosophy of like living, breathing document. Basically, loosely interpret the Supreme Court to see what can the government do and not do. It's something that evolves over time, and we're deciding that these words on the page that don't actually matter insofar as they're strictly written. So they would be adopting what they often call the activist judge position. They would be the activists in this scenario. So we'll see what happens. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, the fact that we're even debating this, the fact that this case has gone this far is honestly absolutely insane. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.